Some more reviews from Pauline Kael's Going Steady, published in 1969. Romeo and Juliet, Franco Zeffirelli's new tale from Shakespeare, employs the latest techniques of bowdlerization. Apparently to attract teenagers, Zeffirelli loads on what academic bowdlerizers used to take out. His movie of The Taming of the Shrew seemed to be always on the edge of bursting into song. It made me wish I were seeing Kiss Me, Kate. His Romeo and Juliet does not make me long for West Side Story. What could? But it certainly suggests it, not only in the use of unaristocratic teenage gangs and a freaked-out Mercutio, played by John McInerney, but in the basic strategy, which suggests The Graduate as well. Some odd readings by Lady Capulet, and particularly by Friar Lawrence when he says, "I dare no longer stay," suggest that his teenage tragedy is partly the result of teenagers' betrayal by their elders. It's a bit ugly to see Shakespeare used for being with it. Movie makers drill into the generation gap as if it were an oil well. Zeffirelli's version is lusty and rambunctious and busty, of course, and he provides a fashion show in codpieces, two-toned with fringe and bows and laces. The one element he removes that the other bowdlerizers also removed is Shakespeare's language. Nobody got exercised over what he did to the language of The Taming of the Shrew, because there's not much poetry there anyway. But Romeo and Juliet is another matter. It's not that there is perhaps only about half of Shakespeare's play left that is upsetting, but that the quotations from Shakespeare that are left don't build up the rhythms of a poetic play. Heard in isolated fragments, the lines just seem a funny way of talking that is hard to understand. The movie is being sold, of course, on its youth appeal, on teenagers playing teenagers, but you can always make a movie with kids playing kids. The feat would be if the kids could read Shakespeare. The lines are unintelligible because the actors' faces and bodies aren't in tune with the words. Anyone who has ever been in a school production of Shakespeare has learned to his shame those great lines don't mean anything to an audience unless you have the training to make them sound as if you always talked that way. Pat Haywood, playing the nurse, as a countrywoman, and not too ancient, which is a pleasant change, is almost the only one of the principals who manages this, so in her scenes the meaning registers. Perhaps the main reason we go to Shakespeare performances in the theater or at the movies is for the happy square excitement of hearing those marvelous lines. Here the voices and readings are so tonelessly mediocre that one hardly hears the words at all. There's not one memorable reading. The music of the great lines is missing, and without it the idiocies of the plot shine forth. Zeffirelli has not, however, left a total vacuum. He has replaced the poetry with his own cinematic version of poetry. This Romeo and Juliet is about two young, unlucky kids in love. They communicate with eyes and mouths and smiles in close-up, not in words. The lines of Shakespeare that they speak are redundant as well as meaningless. Olivia Hussey, playing Juliet, her childish eyes wide open and her mouth open too, and Leonard Whiting, playing Romeo, his hair cut like a suburban hippie's, are not really bad. They're rather sweet, and in some ways their simplicity, the simplicity of reasonably talented blank young actors that is so familiar to us from television, is pleasing. But they're as banal in their youth and innocence as the high school kids in Peyton Place. Like the lovers in West Side Story, they have been made ordinary kids in trouble. In Shakespeare's version, they played together at poetry and at love. They made love through poetry, matching each other's conceits. Here the actors seem dear little children playing at the director's notion of teenage sex hunger, and despite the words, they look and move like inarticulate modern kids in the latest movie cycle. Zeffirelli supplies them with nonverbal lyricism. Romeo leaps from Juliet's balcony and runs for joy through a green glade. This is recognizable as a new convention. We know we're not supposed to think about the dusty summer streets of the previous shots, which may also be a new convention. Zeffirelli is very high on dust. But if you're going to go in for the trite lyricism of running through the woods, you'd better be more of a movie maker than Zeffirelli. The scene is shot like the romantic, full of the joy of life sequences in a dozen current second-rate movies. When he aims for exuberance, he generally settles for overacting or for images that convey commonplace high spirits and coyness and puppy love. As a movie director, Zeffirelli has a limited sense of movement, and his cinematic effects are forced. He goes in for strenuous knockabout stuff, for brawling, cavorting young men, and for revels and roistering that have an awful way of suggesting the supers at the opera trying to keep the stage active. For immediacy, he plunges the camera into this busy work, which inevitably includes somebody getting kicked in the bottom. In the duel between Mercutio and Tybalt, and particularly in the big sword fight between Romeo and Tybalt, with Michael York's Tybalt coming on as a bullish matador, his camera in the midst of the horse's hoofs technique sometimes works excitingly, perhaps because these sequences, like the scene of the baiting of the nurse, are conceived in extravagant terms. When Zeffirelli is extravagant, he often succeeds in providing some of the flourishes and the urgency that have been lost in the cutting of the play. But the realistic locations are used like parts of a stage. We can't get our bearings. We never really know where we are in this movie. We get no sense of movement in relation to place. The interiors have no exteriors. We are at a ball without having entered the room or having got a sense of its scale. Theatricality can be effective in a movie when it is consciously used, but it's very awkward when the director is trying for realism, which Zeffirelli apparently takes horseplay and opulent clutter and dust to be. He brings to the screen the filler of opera, all that coarse, earthy stuff that comes on when the main singers are off. And Zeffirelli's robust, realistic detail is ludicrous. When he throws up a close-up of the marketplace onto the screen and we see the peppers and onions, it's like the obligatory setting of the scene in the first act of an opera when the peasant girl walks on with her basket on her arm. And when Michael York enters, in a series of close-ups working up from calves and thighs to torso to face, the camera is used to make an elaborate kind of stage entrance. Among the many reasons for giggling at this is that it reminds one of Fred Astaire's description of Sid Charisse in The Bandwagon. She came at me in sections. The visual compositions are generally academic, and the camera movement and the editing, too, are often just nervous. Zeffirelli may, however, have hit on something that could knock kids silly. Once Mercutio and Tybalt are dead, the luscious Nino Rota music, the kind of music you feel you've been hearing on car radios all your life, even though you hear it for the first time, which you sure know won't be the last, is poured on in emotional torrents, and the movie is filled with weeping and lamentation and carrying on. Romeo flings himself to the floor while Juliet, hair streaming, bangs herself against the wall. All this violence and hysteria appear to come out of nowhere, because these little child lovers, with their baby talk, hardly seem to have the sensuality or the grand passion to go mad this way. They are so pure and sweet in bed that it is like a toy marriage. There's nothing in Shakespeare, or in the characters we have seen, to prepare us for this. It's out of every wonderfully absurd operatic love-death, and kids unfamiliar with this tradition may really go for it. It's a new development, in a way. Teenagers as grand and passionate. The movie gets so theatrical, in a 19th century melodramatic fashion, that it begins to be rather fascinating. The lighting even resembles the unmodified yellowish lighting of an opera stage. There are moments when the production is so bizarre and excessive it suggests Throne of Blood and Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, but then it slips back into horse opera with someone yelling, "Montague!" like Geronimo. This movie comes at you in sections. The whole thing cries out for arias, but if it were an opera, Zeffirelli might cast non-singers. In retrospect, one may feel affection for importantly bad movies, for the unusual messes that show some talent and lots of aspiration and take themselves seriously enough to convince some people that they are works of art. Remember Voice in the Wind with Francis Lederer as a deranged concert pianist, or Ben Hecht's Spectre of the Rose, or Mickey One or Privilege. And I think a Bergman film like Hour of the Wolf belongs in this group. It's characteristic of these prestige-laden flops that they're so bad they often verge on self-parody, and that their champions explain their box office failures by saying that they're ahead of their time. Pictures like these are not mediocrities. That's the best thing to be said for them. They're awful. But they do at least have some kind of character. They may be hell to sit through, but you don't forget that you saw them. This crazy Romeo and Juliet, with its bare-assed Romeo, and its shots that look like ads for The Boy, and its Juliet leaning so far out of her dress in the balcony scene that instead of listening to her, we watch her bosom as she struggles with problems of breath control, may even be a hit. There are a lot of romantic teenagers, and a lot of other people who still have their teenage romanticism intact. This could be a make-out movie for teenagers, the way A Man and a Woman was for college students. Bullitt is efficiently made and extremely well edited, but basically uninteresting. It's an example of commercial formalism. A competent director, Peter Yates, working with competent technicians, has given a fairly dense texture to a hackneyed script about cops and gangsters and politicians. Yates doesn't have the directorial flair that John Boorman brought to a comparable melodrama, Point Blank, but he does an honest, brutal job in this dishonest business of making movies about nothing. With his low-key charisma, Steve McQueen plays the police officer hero seriously and well, but I prefer the fun and romantic fantasy of his Thomas Crown. When movies are as gratuitous as this one is, it hardly seems too much to ask for the leavening of a little humor. Bullitt is solemn even when it is dealing with a slimy Mr. Big, played by Robert Vaughn, whose technique of bribery is so blatantly insulting he couldn't give away a lollipop. But Yates has a good, serviceable technique for integrating staged movie action into documentary city locations. San Francisco is used for the interiors as well as the exteriors, and is shown to best advantage in a spectacular chase sequence, with cars bouncing up and down those witty, steep streets. All horrors are grist for the Hollywood mill, but cheap exploitation films don't disguise their purposes, whereas an expensive, responsible film, like The Boston Strangler, with real stars like Henry Fonda and Tony Curtis, deals with brutality and madness tastefully, in safe academic terms, thus offering perversions with polite reassurances. It's money that makes a film look responsible. In this movie, the sympathy extended to the miserable and perverted seems only a token of what they could get within clean white walls if they would just offer themselves up for treatment. Those who have seen Titicut Follies and observed the horrors within the dirty white walls of the institution that Albert de Salvo, the alleged strangler, was sent to, may be a little shocked by the new movie's assurances. The good taste of the Boston Strangler is a form of inadequacy. The material cries out for revelations, but the movie offers no illumination of human conduct, nothing that would help us understand the nature or the crimes or the criminal, only a facile account of split personality that is not only unilluminating, but unconvincing. If the movie makers don't know any more than that, why are they making the movie? This clearly troubles them too. They want to be respectable. Like In Cold Blood, the Boston Strangler constantly, almost compulsively, raises the question of why it has been made. Unable to face the reasons that are all too obvious, it trumps up reasons. Since DeSalvo hasn't been executed, there is no handy issue like capital punishment for this one. At times it is rather ludicrously suggested that it's a cautionary movie made to warn women against opening their doors to strangers, though it can't resist getting easy laughs on nervous old ladies buying locks. It winds up with a fancy statement about how society should develop methods for the early detection of psychological disorders, an ending that may have made everybody working on the movie feel better, but that is totally irrelevant since the movie does not indicate that there was anything wrong with DeSalvo, played by Tony Curtis, with a badly joined false nose bridge, that could have been detected before the murders. I know there are people of wide interests. Still, I wonder what kind of revelation could have been expected from a decent Hollywood factory sort of director like Richard Fleischer, who goes from The Happy Time to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing to The Vikings to Compulsion to Crack in the Mirror to The Big Gamble to Barabbas to Fantastic Voyage to Dr. Dolittle to The Boston Strangler, and is now at work on Che, starring Omar Sharif, with Jack Palance as Fidel Castro.